We good, Elizabeth? Go. All right. After thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure to see this room filled with leaders from across our community. You can really get a sense of this luncheon has become one of the Weidenbaum Center's most valued traditions. My name is Andrew Reeves. I am the director of the Weidenbaum Center, and I'm professor of political science here at Washington University. For those new to the center, let me say a word about our mission. We were founded in 1975. The Weidenbaum Center connects rigorous social science research with real policy conversations and supports programs that address today's economic, political, and social challenges through careful evidence and analysis. We are resolutely nonpartisan, and all that we do is grounded in data, facts, theory, and diverse perspectives, not ideology. The goal is to foster understanding and help both policymakers and citizens think more clearly about the issues that shape civic life. This particular event exists because of one person's vision and sustained leadership. 8 years ago, Molly Klein imagined a gathering that would bring women together around policy ideas and research. She strengthened this luncheon every year since. Molly, thank you for your leadership and your commitment to this center and to this community. Since I became director, this event has really served as a model for the kind of center that I want us to be. It reflects the energy and intellectual seriousness that brings you together today from so many different walks of life. You care about ideas and about from field leading scholars about the challenges that shape public life. One of the things that distinguishes this gathering is its spirit of inquiry. By being in this room, you're willing to engage in arguments that may challenge your assumptions and evidence that complicates easy answers. And that willingness is the foundation of serious public discourse. We often say that communities benefit from their universities, and I think that's true, but universities are nothing without their community. The work we do only matters because of people who are willing to engage, to listen, and to carry these conversations into civic life. I'll note that if anyone embodies that spirit of citizenship, it's Molly, who has brought this community together around ideas and public purpose. We are very excited for today's program and for the discussion it will generate. Thank you again for being here. I hope you enjoy your lunch and conversation, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Pippert-Larson. Elizabeth is the Associate Director of the Weidenbaum Center. She will moderate today's program. Elizabeth leads the center's financial strategy, manages research initiatives, and directs public events that bring academic insight into policy conversations. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Larson.
Thank you, Andrew. And say how delighted we are that you joined us out of the freezing cold and snow for our 8th Weidenbaum Center Public Policy Luncheon. It's truly my favorite event of the year, and it's so good to see so many faces again and new ones today. We are thrilled that you're here and grateful to share what promises to be a terrific and thoughtful program. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce the hostess of today's event, Dr. Molly Klein, who's going to offer a few remarks. Dr. Molly Klein has served as co-chair of the Weidenbaum Center Advisory Committee, along with Steve Knight, for the past 4 years. In 2017, she founded the Women's Networking Luncheon and Public Policy event, which has continued to grow and thrive under her leadership. A pathologist by training, she earned both her MS and PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She spent more than 40 years working in plant science and commercial agriculture, including 27 years at the Monsanto Company here in St. Louis, where she was part of the team that introduced the first agricultural biotechnology crops. Since retiring in 2010, she has devoted herself to volunteer leadership. So in addition to her service with the Weidenbaum Center, she is the busiest woman in St. Louis. She is actively involved with the YWCA Metro St. Louis, SSM Health Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital Foundation, the Danforth Science Center, the St. Louis Forum, and Focus St. Louis. She has been married for 46 years, and she and her husband have 2 adult children and 2 precious grandsons. So please join me in welcoming Molly Flynn.
How's that? Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Andrew. You might wonder, how could someone trained in plant pathology, and by the way, my patients never speak. Today, I believe so. No. Continuous learner, a good citizen, and a more informed citizen. And that's how, after my retirement, I was invited to come to a Weidenbaum Center event, and that's how I got started. And that was 14 years ago already. Again, it's a real honor. Steve Knight, first gentleman of this event, to welcome you here today. Thanks for bringing the weather today. And thank you for your precious time. And boy, am I glad that that storm wasn't yesterday or Sunday, that at least it started on Saturday. Today, I guarantee you, this will be worth your time that you came to this event. You're going to hear 2 world-class scholars today, Professors Adia Wingfield and Professor Clarissa Hayward. Or Ward, I'm sorry. Raise your hand so everybody can see you. Yeah. And as you've already heard, this is the 8th Women's Luncheon and Public Policy event, founded in 2017. And it was intentional. We said we want to introduce the Weidenbaum Center and the important work done through the center to more women in the St. Louis community, to more UAs in that community. And you do not need to be an alumni to come to this event or any center event, and that would be the case for me. So our first event, we had about 35 attendees, and it's grown each year, as as Andrew has mentioned. Last year, we had over about 100. This year, we had over 144 register. So this is exactly what we envisioned, a room full of very accomplished women of varied ages, disciplines, and in many different phases of their own careers, just starting, to those of us who are already retired or rewired. Where's Ruth? Raise your hand. Yes, ask Ruth about that. Yes. So we are awesome. Yay. Thank you again for making this day happen by your presence and your participation, because there is going to be a chance to participate. It warms my heart to see you. And many of you I've known for over 25 years, and many of you have known each other for even more than that. So I even heard some new stories today of ladies that went to high school together. Yes. If this is your first Weidenbaum Center event, please raise your hand. Just curious. Oh, okay. Or not. In either case, you will get a look at the scholarly research conducted by Weidenbaum Center affiliated professors at WashU. And this is going to be exemplified by our speakers today. And it is for this very reason that I've been a supporter of the center. And being a scientist myself, it's very important that the information I want to rely on for being a good citizen comes based on facts and data. So with that, please listen in, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy today's discussion. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Molly. And as Andrew shared at the start, the Weidenbaum Center is a research institute that supports social science research. And our mission is to serve as a bridge between scholars, policymakers, and the public. We're also entirely 100% donor supported. And so I want to pause for a moment to thank the donors in the room that are here today. Your generosity has made events like this one possible. We are very deeply grateful for you. So this year, we're doing something a little bit different. Each of our speakers will share remarks, a brief period of questions from the audience. And then at the end of the program, we will spend some time, 30 minutes, in guided table discussion. One of the strongest pieces of feedback from last year was the desire for more time to process what we have heard and to think together about the application. So at the Weidenbaum Center, we are committed to space for thoughtful reflection. So we have heard you and we are implementing that. And I'm excited to guide us through that conversation today. We do know that some of you have other commitments. And so if you need to leave at the conclusion of Clarissa's remarks, there will be a natural moment to do so. But I hope that many of you as possible will be able to stay and participate in our conversation. So with that, let's get started. Adia will speak first, followed by questions, and then we'll hear from Clarissa again with time for questions. So let's just dive right in. Professor Adia Wingfield is the Mary Tileston Hemenway Professor of Arts and Sciences and Assistant Vice Provost, where she co-directs the Office of Public Scholarship. Sociologist, her research examines how the intersections of race, gender, and class shape social processes at work. She is the author of several books, most recently, Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. This book was named one of Publishers Weekly's most best books of 2023. She earned her PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming Adia Wingfield.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here to address you all, and I'm just setting my timer because I know we have a strict schedule to follow. So as Clarissa mentioned, I'll be talking about from my most recent book, Gray Areas, which focuses on racial inequality, racial and gender inequality in workplaces broadly. And this is pretty closely aligned with most of the research that I've done over the course of my career, which has looked at racial and gender inequality in a variety of professions and industries, ranging from healthcare to education, to the legal system, to engineering and STEM fields, and so on. So to give a little bit of background for what I'll talk about in my remarks today, it's useful to give a little bit of demographic data first. If we look at census data from US in 2019, we see when we look at what the population of the United States looks like is a fairly racially diverse country. At about 30% each non-Hispanic white women and men, about 7% each Black women, about 9% each Hispanic women and men, and about 3% each Asian American women and men, who constitute one of our fastest growing populations in the country. So when we look over what the demographics of the United States look like, we see a picture of a country that is fairly racially diverse and continuing to progress along these lines. When we look at representation of workers in what we might consider some of our most elite, high-profile, prestigious positions, the picture that we see from the numbers is pretty disconnected from the data that I just showed you on the previous slide. If we look at Congress, and this data is from 2017, but we haven't seen marked shifts in time since then. But if we look at Congress, we're looking at 80% representation from white men, state political executives, 78%, corporate executive officers, 85%, CEOs of Wall Street firms, 100%, Fortune 500 CEOs, 95%, academics along these lines with tenured professors at 73% of white men. Heads of venture capital firms are 97% white men, and owners of television and licenses are also 97% white men. This does not look like the previous slide. And so to me, as a sociologist who wants to understand why we see certain patterns emerging in data, this presents kind of a curious paradox. And it brings me to think about these questions related to work and race today, and what's emerged to me as a question that I wanted to dig into a little bit more. When we look at the bigger picture, or the broader assessment of what work looks like today and the racial demographics that are a part of our workplaces, there are a few things that stand out to me that seem to be contradictory. For one thing, we know that in 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed explicit legal racial discrimination and created an environment where it became illegal to discriminate based on race, to say that you would not be willing to hire people of certain racial backgrounds because of that racial background. We also know that up until recently, and even with some recent changes in our legislative environment, has been a multi-billion-dollar industry. It has been a growth field, and we've seen a lot of investment, and we've seen a lot of energy and focus devoted. It's been a pretty vast industry where workers and a lot of leaders have focused on trying to think through and identify how they can attach these principles to their organizations. At the same time, we also know that workers in all places report interest in workplaces that address diversity. And this spans the gamut of the racial groups that I mentioned. Survey after survey data shows that this is something that workers say that they want to see in their organizations. They value diversity. They want to see organizations commit to this. At the same time, though, Black workers remain underrepresented in leadership roles across industries. They are subject to racial wage gaps, and this occurs when we control for experience, for education, for time on a job, and things like that. We also know that Black workers tend to be concentrated in lower status occupations that have little job security or prospects for mobility. How can both of those things be true? Or how can all of these things be true, I should say? So to me, this emerges a bigger question of why. We see these disparities present. Has been for some time a multi-billion-dollar industry. Why do some of the that I've described persist over 50 years after the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964? Why do the top ranks of so many industries fail to reflect an increasingly racially diverse population? And what I'm here today in this presentation, and what I argue in much more detail in my book, is that there are a few things we can attribute to this not being, and there are some pretty clear patterns in the data that evidence what this is attributed to. We can't make the case anymore that this is because of a lack of qualified workers. We've seen educational attainment among Black workers for pretty much the last 50 years. We know from survey data again that Black workers, especially Black women workers, are more likely to express more of an interest in promotion and mobility than other racial groups. So it's not that we're in a place anymore where simply these qualified, motivated, talented workers are not out there. It's also not a result anymore of explicit racial discrimination. And I don't make this case to argue that racial discrimination no longer happens, but again, the Civil Rights Act that has made clear that the type of legal explicit racial discrimination of a past era is no longer permissible in the same type of outright, overt way that it was present. Well, today, though, that when we take a closer look at many of our innocuous quotidian social processes that are a part of places and are a part of organizations, if we look a little bit more closely at these processes, this is where we see how aspects of the ways that we work actually serve to maintain racial inequality that can leave these patterns present, even despite some of the broader systemic and structural changes that we've attempted to put into place. I refer to these broader patterns as the gray areas of our organizations and our workplaces. And so when I think about the gray areas, I'm thinking about the parts of how we work that are not explicitly defined or delineated, but still have implications for how we get our work done and how our organizations function. So for example, my job, as you know, is a college professor. I'm required to do teaching, research, and service, sometimes more service than I think I should be doing, but that's another conversation. But if you look at my job contract, it specifies that the things that I'm responsible for doing are teaching a set load of courses, for maintaining an active research agenda, and contributing to department or universal service. What my job contract doesn't say, and what it will never specify, is that if I'm interested in upward mobility in my career field, I have to make sure that I'm maintaining connections and ties and networks to certain people who can give me information about other jobs that might be available if the one that I have is not working. And I'm not suggesting that's the case, just describing how these patterns occur. What my job contract will describe is that if I want to make sure that I'm seeing the upward mobility that's expected in my field, I have to make sure that I have relationships with mentors, with sponsors, with people who can say, make sure that you're publishing in this journal and not that journal. Make sure that now you're thinking about making that you're getting your book done, but now is the time and not later. Make sure that you're connecting with certain people who can write you the reviews that you need when you're going through the tenure process. None of these things get said in our job contracts, but these are examples of the gray areas that are a part of everyone's job, that are the sociological processes that shape our progressions through our workplaces and through our organizations in ways that, again, can be detrimental and in some cases even devastating to Black workers. So when I'm talking about the gray areas here, I'm referring to three core areas: hiring, organizational culture, and advancement. Again, these are unspecified and usually not clearly laid out in any of our jobs, but they're still very fundamental components of how we work that have outsized implications for the ways that we connect with our coworkers, with our bosses, with our colleagues, with our clients in ways that can produce the types of racial inequality that I've been describing. So okay, we'll just stick with constants since I don't, okay. Sorry. All right. Apologies. We'll stick with constants. To describe the processes of gray areas that I've touched on, what I do in the book is I walk through the job trajectories of seven different Black workers who hail from a variety of fields. I'm not going to go through all 7 today in the interest of time. I'm walking through a few of these workers and the experiences with the gray areas that I've discussed. So Constance is the first example that I'll give. And Constance is an engineer. She's a chemical engineer that works at a major US research university. And so Constance is a useful example of this way that gray areas in hiring function as social processes that can really matter a lot in shaping the trajectory of a worker's long-term career. Constance, as I mentioned, from the outside looking in, you would think she's done it. She's made it. She's got it all. She's got this tenured position. She's working at this university. She's doing chemical engineering. She's living a dream. Talk with Constance a little bit more about the process through which she got there and some of the challenges that she's faced. It becomes a lot clearer how the gray areas associated with hiring have implications for her career trajectory. So I've got 3 quotes here that I'll draw you to the middle quote, which stands out to me as an example of the ways that hiring functions as a gray area, where social connections and relationships can matter in complicated ways for Black workers and Black women workers in particular. So this quote comes from a conversation that I had with Constance about just this process of networking and connecting in her field. And she told me, people to get in the in crowd, because I'm introverted anyway, on top of being a Black woman, not being known, it has been terrible. I hate it. If it was just based on merit, the networks didn't matter so much, I'd be much better positioned. But the network sort's missing. So I missed out on all kinds of things: awards, nominations, proposals. So to give a little bit of context, I want to talk to Constance about her career trajectory. She described a process where, coming out of her PhD program, many graduate students, she was feeling pretty uncertain and unsure about what was next for her. She had doubts about her ability to maintain the type of research trajectory that's necessary for a tenure track position at an R1 university. Her advisor was the one who encouraged her, who some of his contacts, to say, you know, Constance is a really good candidate for this position. I think you should hire her. I think she would really be able to do the job well. What Constance didn't realize immediately, though, was that when she accepted the position where she received her first offer, she was immediately switching fields. And I think this to my own experience as a sociologist. My degree is in sociology, but if I took a job in a business school, I took a job in an African American studies department, a women's studies department. My research relates to all of those things, but the networks and the relationships that I developed out of my graduate program in sociology would be far less applicable in those areas than they would be in a sociology department. And this is the environment that Constance found herself in. So once she started her tenure track position, her networks got her in the door, but she quickly realized that she was lacking the type of networks that were going to be critical to maintaining the type of long-term career trajectory that she had envisioned for herself. So that put Constance in a position where basically she had to start over from scratch. She had to begin building these networks without her advisor's connections. She had to begin building these networks in an environment where, as one of the few Black women in this field, she did not have a lot of connections. She did not have a lot of previously established relationships. And she felt herself really grappling with the perceptions that she did not fit in, that she was not in the in crowd, and that she wasn't a person who had the skills and knowledge and the camaraderie necessary to build the types of long-term relationships that were going to be critical for her advancement. And you see this reflected in her efforts to the awards, the nominations, the proposals, the things that she doesn't get tapped into because she does not have the social networks and the connections to allow and facilitate that. So I'll move now to Brian. Brian offers a different example of thinking about organizational culture. And it's an interesting case study for me to talk to because he works in the film industry, which is very far from my career trajectory and experience. So it was interesting to get inside information about why certain films make it, why other films don't make it, and to offer my own views about some films that I'd seen that I thought should not have made it to the point that they did. But it was a side conversation. So in discussing with Brian his views about the organizational culture, the studio, he gives this quote that I'll contextualize in a moment. Draw your attention again to the bolded quote where he says to me, everything most people think about vis-a-vis filmmaking, their assumptions about how the system is rigged against them, and the majority of Black people think that in Hollywood. Those assumptions were proven correct. This is a company that values innovation, values loyalty, values taking initiative, so it claims. But the studio heads put values online that are not espoused. So again, to offer some context for why Brian says this, he was hired shortly after the Oscars So White controversy in 2015 and 2016. And if you don't remember this occurred after, for the second or third year in a row, the nominees for Best Actor and Best Actress in the Oscars categories were all white actors and actresses. So there was some public outcry, some social media response where people pointed out that the slate of candidates could have been a lot more racially diverse. And the studio that hired Brian said, basically, we're listening to this controversy, we hear it, we want to do something about it. We want to bring you because you've expressed that you have this vision for introducing this diverse array of potential films. And we want to get behind that and we want to support that. But what you find, if you have a chance to take a look at these second quotes, is that when Brian attempted to do exactly what he was hired to do, which was to diversify the slate of films that the studio put forth, he was met repeatedly with a phrase that studio heads told him over and over again, which was, these films don't make money. These arguments were to shut down the films that Brian was trying to advance, even despite contradictory evidence. He was able to point out, he was able to point to data showing that the track record of the filmmakers that he wanted to bring to bear actually did make money, and that these were filmmakers who had actually been able to bring more of a return on their budget than what they had actually put in. But as you see from the quotes here, the studio heads with whom he was working focused on or impressed by the factual data. They were committed to an organizational culture that we might think of as focused on the market-based economy of filmmaking. The idea that if something isn't making money, if something isn't making money, then we can turn it down, we can move away from it, without ever having to mention that these are films that would advance diversity, because the focus is much more on the market-based economy, or ostensibly on the market-based economy of the film industry. So what Brian found was that even though he was hired to help create more diversity from the film output, the organizational culture of the studio was one that focused on the ideas around market economies, allowed them to avoid in favor of the diversity that Brian was hired to do. So he found it very complicated to do the basics of his job because the organizational culture of the studio instead employed logics that allowed them to turn away from the films that he was bringing. I just want to highlight here that one of the points that he made that really stood out to me was attempting to bring particular scripts and project ideas to executives. One of the executives that wanted to pass on his film was an executive that passed on the movie Moonlight. If you notice, you remember this was a Best Picture winner from that it came out, showing that studio had, you could argue, had made some missteps, at least in the past, when it came to evaluating the potential success of certain films. So finally, I want to cover the discussion of advancement as a third gray area. And when we talk about advancement, it's an interesting area to bring up because I think we have these ideas in the US of advancement being this meritocratic process. If you're the person who's the best candidate for the job, then you'll advance and you'll be rewarded with upward mobility. Data shows that is not how advancement happens. And what Kevin found out as a worker in the nonprofit industry, particularly a nonprofit focused on education, was that it was more so his connections and relationships with supervisors that facilitated, or in his case, stymied his opportunities for advancement. And what Kevin learned was that as a Black man working in a predominantly feminized field, many of his and colleagues and supervisors said that they didn't see him as someone who really belonged in the leadership role. And this was often disconnected from his performance evaluations, from the work that he did in the nonprofit. The view was simply that he wasn't someone who fit their idea of what a leader should be. And so I have a quote over here that I'd like to draw your attention to from Kevin, where he says, "It's a whole balancing act where I'm trying to modulate my voice, my behavior. And it's hard because I want to be an ally, but if I'm a normal Black guy who doesn't read up on those things, then you always have to be, you have to use a certain voice, then I'm not going to succeed because I'm not going to advance." So I highlighted this quote from Kevin here because I think it underscores many of the challenges facing Black workers, particularly Black men workers, when they are in environments where they are in the minority because of race and gender. This process of trying to anticipate the discriminatory treatment that might be coming forth, putting forth a certain voice, putting forth a certain behavior, putting forth a certain demeanor. These are all parts of the job that may not necessarily come naturally to these workers, but often over time seem to become a necessity. And they become part of how these workers may not necessarily forge the types of relationships with supervisors that facilitate advancement. Again, not because they lack the skills or the experience or the preparation, but because that process of advancement is largely driven by relationships that can be affected by race and gender. So I'll summarize quickly according to my time. I still have 2 minutes. So I'll take those last 2 just to say that I try to argue here that everyday aspects of how we work create pitfalls and obstacles for Black workers. When it comes to hiring, dependence on social networks can sideline Black applicants and employees and affect their long-term trajectory. When it comes to organizational culture, a social climate can make it harder to see patterns that facilitate disparities, as was the case for Brian trying to diversify the studio that he worked for. And when it comes to advancement, managers have an outsized role in promotion, yet are still to have more distance from Black workers, as was the case for Kevin. So I'd like to try to think about how we look at processes present that contribute to racial inequality. So I want to emphasize that research shows that there are some solutions. This doesn't have to be a static picture. Just very briefly, and I can talk about this more during Q&A if people are interested, but research shows that when it comes to hiring, when companies try to expand past their existing social networks to think about other outlets and to recruit from other places that they may have overlooked, this does actually yield more diversity in the applicant pool. When it comes to organizational culture, companies can replace these race-neutral processes with race-conscious ones, and by race-conscious ones, I mean processes and policies that simply take into consideration that it's important to and valuable to have a workforce that acknowledges and includes everyone, people from a variety of backgrounds. And when it comes to advancement, organizations can enhance structural supports for all workers. These can include aspects of incorporating flex time, mentoring programs for everybody, things that can appeal to a variety of different workers to make sure that all workers get included and have these opportunities. Again, I know I'm running out of time, so I'll say again, I'm happy to come back to any of these solutions over Q&A. But essentially, I think that there's still room for us to think, even in this current climate, about ways to make sure that the gray areas of our workplaces don't become fixed and concrete, but that they become ways to think through to prospects and possibilities for more inclusive workplaces for all workers. Thanks.
We don't have people with microphones, so just raise your hand and we'll do 5 minutes of questions with Adia. And obviously, thank you. That was great. Thanks. So please wait for the mic. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Amy Hunter, and I lead DEI and talent acquisition at Clarissa, which is a shoe company here and globally. It's a shoe company everywhere. Thank you, everyone. I just ordered this on Amazon. If you are trying to get that. This particular class is really difficult. This last year, students to keep
Administration. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. For me, I think the important things that I keep in mind is that when you think about organizations and the overall pictures, organizations, companies want to succeed, right? They want to profit, they want to make money that is wide. It's very hard for me to visualize how companies do that if they are not attuned to the great realities of where the 21st century is and where it's going. And the reality is that we are increasingly racially diverse society, we're in a global economy, for companies to be prepared to acknowledge that and to react to that, that inevitably diversity is to be something that you factor in and take into consideration. I think there's actually some cautious and guarded optimism is that when we look at the data that documents the strategies and the approaches that work, there are a lot of things that companies can do that are actually still legal, even in this current regulatory climate. I mentioned expanding access to and thinking about mentoring, mentoring and recruitment. These are things that companies can do. It's still legal to recruit broadly. It's still legal to put into place a mentoring program that is available to everybody, right? So I think it's important for companies to that the data shows in terms of which solutions actually are effective and which things are based on data and which things actually work. And it's also important for companies to stand firm and recognize that moving away from diversity actually is not best interest in the long term. It actually hobbles companies by virtue of narrowing the talent, narrowing the available opportunities for workers to thrive and succeed and to do their best. And I don't say that to downplay what you're facing. I know we're in a climate right now where that is not the kind of sentiment, but I think that climate is being driven by factors that, in my view, are not necessarily solely grounded in thinking about business and organizations and long-term views of organizational successes. And when you look at those things, the data and the answers are pretty clear about where companies benefit most from focusing versus retracting from. Mm-hmm.
Hello. Okay, it's on. Okay, cool. I'm Mega. I have a question that's kind of coming from taking a step back almost into academia. Because something that a lot of my peers faced during grad school, we were discussions about how to talk about the diversity efforts that are being done by companies or by the university, because there's this fine line of you do it quietly and you're focusing on equity. You get equity and equality mixed up all the time. When you're focused on that, you're making change, as though you're not doing enough. But the second that you start promoting the numbers, you talk about, hey, we are doing this to help this particular group succeed, then people come back to you and they'll say, so the only reason you got that job is because you're part of this group. And stepping those, so a lot of my peers have talked about the frustration of, hey, if I check these boxes and I'm saying that I'm part of these groups, they're not hiring me because people are feeling like we're getting too much support. So how do we tread that fine line? How do we, talk about this issue without their side?
It's an interesting question. So I'm going to answer it not so much from a student. I think there's different ways to answer it, right? You can answer that from a student standpoint. You can answer that from an organizational standpoint. I would answer it from an organizational standpoint, also because I've been thinking about that actually from an organizational standpoint. So I actually recently that just came out, sociological review. And part of the argument that I made in that paper is that I think it's really critical for companies to start thinking about these questions very broadly and holistically, because I think you're right that there's been a tendency to think about things related to diversity in kind of a coded way, right? That diversity has been framed all over the paper refers to often connotes what I call the diversity boogeyman, right? This idea that if we're talking about diversity, we're talking about giving people a job that they don't deserve, that they haven't earned, that they shouldn't be doing, and that it leads to all of these crises like plane crashes and train derailments and people who shouldn't be president of Harvard. I'm stretching the argument to say that that's what the diversity suggests, right? The reality of, again, effectively enacted diversity policies, what they do is not to put unqualified people in jobs that they don't deserve, or create train derailments, or create plane crashes, or any of those other things. What they do is they create workplaces where a broader cross-section of workers have a chance to thrive, to bring their skills and talents to a place. Is often, again, very beneficial for companies. And this is so clearly show that companies that are more diverse are more innovative. They have higher financial revenues. They come up with fresh, different ideas because there's more of a cross section of people giving those ideas. So I think the trick is really, again, from an organizational standpoint, to make a case that I don't think that organizations have been making, which is that when we talk about diversity, we talking about it and thinking about it in a way that highlights how it actually really benefits everybody. Right? I don't think that's been the framing that has been used. I think it has been much more narrowly framed around this diversity boogeyman. But think about the ways that a more diverse organization can bring more to a company. I think in contrast of the example of Lauren, for example, and I bring this up in the article as well. Story in 2020 when the racial reckoning was happening in the US. Ralph Lauren was holding some listening sessions at his company, and he was hearing from his employees about what was happening in the country. And so one of his employees in college named James Jetter said, I went to an HBCU, and here's an opportunity we have for an untapped way to think about particular design. We can talk about the aesthetic of HBCUs during this particular historical period. This could be a thing that we're doing as part of the company. So Ralph Lauren agreed. We gave James Jetter permission to put together this design plan. This led to a limited edition of Ralph Lauren designs focused on Morehouse College and Spelman College. It sold out in 24 hours, and it was a huge to the company. And it led to opportunity where the next design collection, I think, focused on Martha's Vineyard. So I bring this up as an example. This isn't a limitation of diversity. This is this company to be part of how this particular company functions and how new ideas come to bear and how new ideas come to bear in ways that are very beneficial for the company, for the employees, for the overall line. I gave this example of one, but we can think about this type of benefit extends if we're thinking about healthcare, if we're thinking about education, about how, again, people with different ideas bring to a company, then weeding out those people and narrowly focusing who to have in an organizational standpoint. And I just think that for companies to think about how to thread that needle, we do better if we're talking about how benefits from diversity in healthcare, which means more people longer and having better health. Benefit from diversity in education because it means more perspectives and more people seeing how their education is beneficial in the short and long term. That's an example, but I think this is a way for companies to think about how to step away from what you're describing, right? Rightfully so, this idea that talking about diversity has these sliding negative effects because it's this view that it's only to a certain narrow cross-section of the population who's cast as being a group that doesn't deserve it.
I just want to.
Do the last question.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much. This was so enlightening. I appreciate it. And I appreciated the way that you highlighted the systemic issues that exist in workplace. I'm curious, you layer on top of that sort of the macro, from it. And just so jobs, I think about Catherine Ann Edwards, who, documented the racial and the wage gap and that 600,000 women left the workplace. As you think about individuals, communities, institutions, how do you understand not only these like pervasive systemic issues, also these issues to equate to a compounding issue that could potentially, cause companies to lose talent.
Be quick. Okay, yeah, it's a big question. Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think kind of the answer is in some of what you said, right? That it's easy to look at these losses and kind of trivialize them or push them aside or act as if they don't matter. But it's easy to do that if you're not thinking about kind of the broader fabric of society and how we all matter. Everyone's voices and contributions are critical and essential for moving forward, especially again, as we continue to be a multiracial society. So my view is that it matters a lot to think about these systemic processes that are driving Black women out of the workplaces, that are maintaining these racial and gendered wage gaps, because ultimately that means talent, potential, skills, resources that are being untapped and that are hindering us as a collective, broader society. And I think that illustrates part of the that it's easy to marginalize and dismiss certain groups as groups that don't have potential or don't have things to offer or don't have things to give. But that is not what the data shows, right? Data shows and indicates very clearly that benefit from societies where everybody has the opportunity to thrive and to live up to their potential and to offer what they can and to have the resources to be able to do that. So for me, it comes back to thinking about society and social structures from that viewpoint, and that we lose a lot marginalizing and pushing out whole groups from being able to thrive and incorporate and offer what they can to the broader society. Oh, okay.
One more.
Sure.
Last question. Last.
I will be quick. I just wanted to make sure those two. So like to do that too. So I just wanted to flag.
I mentioned the paper that I wrote for the American Sociological Review. That is one of the arguments that I make in that paper, that we want to have this expansive, inclusive view of DEI for exactly that reason, right? That we don't benefit from overlooking groups, and that DEI benefits everyone when we were thinking about the broad ways that different groups benefit from having their voices and their experiences and their lives included in how organizations function.
Thank you so much, Adia. Thank you. Okay. All right. Professor Clarissa Hayward is a contemporary political theorist whose research and teaching focus on theories of power, democratic theory, identity, and American urban politics. Her work centers on three core questions. What is social power and how does it shape human? What does democratic government entail, both in theory and practice? And how are social identities created and sustained? Today, she will discuss how small groups of people who share core values, bring different perspectives and lived experiences, can collectively develop powerful ideas that reshape how we think about politics and social change. She has published 3 books and earned her PhD from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Clarissa Hayward.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to follow Adia's lead setting, so I don't do what professors sometimes do, which is talk too much. Okay. So I'm a professor in the political science department here, and the sort of core areas that my research and teaching focus on is democratic theory, which is a branch of political philosophy that asks big conceptual questions about what democracy is and how democracy works. So I'm going to start out just looking at like the etymology of the word democracy. Demos is Greek for the people, and kratos is Greek for power. So at the very most basic level, democracy is a system where the people have the power. Specifically, when the ancient Greeks talked about the demos, they were talking about not the people in some abstract sense, like, the Canadian people or something, but the ordinary people, as opposed to the elites. So the heart of the idea of democracy is that the people are the ones who have the power, which I think raises the obvious question, the power to do what? Very minimum, I think you would say the power to choose among alternatives. So here we have A, B, and C, which could be 3 different policies or 3 different candidates. And the idea here is that the people have decision-making power. Most democratic theorists would also add that the people, the ordinary people, should have agenda-setting power. So the power to decide, for example, that we're going to choose among A, B, and C instead of among D, E, and today what I want to do is take sort of one step further and talk about something that democratic theory pays a little bit less attention to. And I'm going to call it generative power. Talk about how ordinary people sometimes have the power to generate political ideas. So, for example, to define political problems, to create political concepts and frameworks for thinking about those concepts, and to generate new possibilities for organizing political life. So on the slide there, I tried to give you sort of a less familiar, you can imagine the creation of a brand new letter. The idea is that before the creation of the letter, nobody could choose between it and some other option, and nobody could decide to place it on the agenda. So the creation of the letter actually changes what the choosers choose among. In politics, new political ideas can be similarly transformative. They can change the way that citizens and policymakers think about what the important political problems are and the ways that we imagine solutions, possible solutions to those problems. So to give you an example, think about the idea of marriage equality. Or, I'm going to pick an example from the opposite side of the ideological spectrum. Think about the idea of gun rights, specifically understood as individual rights to own a private gun. Those ideas enabled people to make political claims that they couldn't have made until somebody came up with them. They enabled people to pay for and vote for against something that half a century ago they couldn't have. So those are politically transformative ideas that create new possibilities for democratic politics. And the question I want to ask today is, where do ideas like those come from? Do they always have to come from elites and experts? Or is there a way for the people, understood as, the ordinary people, to exercise this kind of generative power? My answer to that question is yes, there is a way. In democracies, can exercise generative power. They don't do that in mass publics. So they don't do that, for example, in big inclusive town halls or through mass public opinion surveys. Instead, ordinary people exercise generative power through what some democratic theorists call deliberative enclaves. So what are these? These are small-scale settings. People who share important political goals and values and commitments, but who have very different experiences and perspectives, come together and they talk to one another about their urgent political concerns. If democracy is ruled by the people, if deliberative enclaves are the source of ordinary people's generative power, then these sites of political idea generation matter just as much to democracy as some much more familiar institutions that we tend to focus on more, such as elections. So I want to do three things with the rest of my time today. First, I want to give you a very concrete example of a deliberative enclave. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think it is that makes deliberative enclaves special. So what it is that gives them this generative power. And finally, I want to conclude by saying something about why and how deliberative enclaves matter for those of us who care about democracy. Okay, so I'm going to start with the example. And I want to share with you an example of a deliberative enclave that developed an idea that shaped everything from Supreme Court decisions to corporate diversity policies to how many large-scale social movements today organize. It was called the Combahee River Collective, and this was a small group. It was formed in Boston in the mid-1970s by these three women, Demeter Frazier, Barbara Smith, and Beverly Smith. They were especially famous for this document, the Combahee River Collective Statement, which they came out with in 1977, and which famously introduced the idea of interlocking oppressions, which is the predecessor to and the origin of the idea of intersectionality. So probably most of us in this room are familiar with that idea. So this is the idea that racism, sexism, heterosexism, and other forms of oppression don't exist independently and operate, as it were, sort of like side by side, one at a time, but instead work together, reinforce one another, and create inequities that it's impossible to understand if you just think about each individual form of oppression on its own. So as I said, like most of us are familiar with that idea. It's been incredibly influential. In 1977, when the Combahee River Collective introduced this idea, it was revolutionary. So the question is, how does a small group like this, and this group at its largest had maybe a dozen core members, how do they create an idea that gets taken up and that travels and that exerts political influence even 50 years into the future? So the answer that I have focused on in my recent research is that deliberative enclaves have an internal structure that is characterized by what I call bounded cognitive diversity. Okay, CD, we'll call it for short. And so the idea is that these politically innovative groups are internally diverse in some really important ways. So specifically, they're cognitively diverse, so that's the CD and BCD. And the B means that that diversity is bounded in the sense that there are limits to the internal diversity of these groups. There are some important groups that all the members share. Now, just to clarify, when I say that a group like the Combahee River Collective is cognitively diverse, I don't necessarily mean it's demographically diverse. It might be, but it's not necessarily. And in fact, the particular group that I'm illustrating this phenomenon with today, the members were, but they're cognitively diverse in the sense that as they went through their lives, they had a range of different experiences that led them to acquire different sets of mental tools, which they used as they made sense of and perceived and acted in the world. So you can think about, for example, something like your mental map of the world. You can think about interpretive frameworks that you use to make sense of certain phenomena that you encounter. Maybe you can think about the tools that you use when you're racing around through some kind of a problem to come up with a solution. Depending on your life, like your family circumstances, your community circumstances, where you went to school, you acquire a set of cognitive tools over the course of your lifetime. I've acquired a different one. Just sort of bring us back to this example, Demeter Frazier, she's the woman right there with the glasses. She came from a really young family. She tended to look at a lot of problems significantly through an economic lens. Smith, who's on the right, she went to Mount Holyoke, and at the time, Mount Holyoke, so that was an experience she had that was really different from other people in the collective. She described as an adult reflecting back on that experience, she said it was horribly isolating, had a really big impact on her. Beverly Smith is actually Barbara's twin sister. She had a very different set of formative experiences as a young adult. She went to the University of Chicago. She went on to get a master's degree in public health. And she worked for many years as a contraceptive counselor to Tileston. So she brought a really different set of focuses and perspectives to their deliberations. She focused a lot on the intersection of gender, race, and public health. So these women didn't experience and think about racism, sexism, heterosexism, and class-based inequities in identical ways. Instead, they had different insights, different experiences that they shared with one another as they deliberated. And that, I think, is the key to why they were able to articulate together a new idea, this idea of interlocking oppressions, that none of them as an individual fully articulated on her own before they came together. So cognitive diversity is really important to generate political ideas. Too much of the wrong kind of diversity can undermine deliberation. And that's where my B for bounded cognitive deliberation comes in. The way I'm thinking about these generative deliberative enclaves, diversity is bounded by some important shared commitments and values and goals. Because I think this is particularly important at our present moment, some basic fundamental shared factual beliefs and premises. So if you imagine counterfactually that the members of the Combahee River Collective, instead of deliberating together with other Black feminists, who came together with a shared commitment to addressing racial, gendered, and sexual oppression, imagine if instead of that, they had tried to include everybody in their deliberations. Okay, so what if they had said, we're going to deliberate with a cross-section of people who lived in Boston in the mid-1970s, including people with really different political beliefs and values and commitments. So it would include people who are anti-feminist, imagine if they had said that. We would include people who are different to or even supportive of the racial inequities that characterized Boston at that time. You can kind of imagine how that might have gone. There would have been a lot of conflict. There would have been lots of subgroup polarization. I think deliberators would be unlikely to trust each other enough to try ideas, and to really listen openly to one another, hear and consider ideas that challenge the ideas that they had come to the deliberation. So that's where the B in invented cognitive diversity comes from. These politically innovative groups are groups of people who have different tools in their cognitive toolboxes, but they have a fairly robust set of commonalities that include overlapping political commitments, goals, and values. And it sort of works as a foundation for a healthy collaborative inquiry. So I've given you an example of a deliberative. It's historical, it comes from the political left. I think there are lots of examples of deliberative enclaves that we could come up with, including examples from the political right. So perhaps somewhat controversially, I'm going to suggest that the Federalist Society is an example of a deliberative enclave. So the Federalist Society, what is it? It's a network of conservative and libertarian scholars and students who have different institutional roles, different forms of expertise, that are bound together by important shared commitments and values. What do? They engage in sustained deliberation. So they have chapter meetings, they have conferences, they have symposia, they have newsletters. And what they've done, I would argue, is they have generated some powerful ideas that have had a major influence on American politics. So for example, the idea that campaign contributions should count as speech. You might think that's a terrible idea. The point is simply that the phenomenon of a deliberative isn't tied to a particular political point of view or a particular set of political commitments. And these enclaves generate political ideas. They can have a powerful impact on politics in very different directions and in very different ways. Okay. Doing well with my time, I'm pleased. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to talk about the significance of deliberative enclaves for democracy. So why should we care? Why do they matter? They do matter, so what? Like, what should we do about it if our goal is to improve our democratic system? If democracy means real people, not just elites, then it's got to mean not just that the people get to choose from some set of options by voting on them, also that they have the power to create new options, to define political problems that face this political society and new ways of addressing those problems. If I'm right, and places where people can exercise generative power is deliberative enclaves, then I think we should care very deeply about whether our political society supports and sustains a robust set of deliberative enclaves, not just enclaves of the rich and the powerful and the privileged. And we should also care about whether the ideas that come out of a set of deliberative enclaves are able to gain traction in the political conversation. I would suggest today that some deliberative enclaves are much better positioned than others to do that. So I think the Federalist Society is an example of a deliberative enclave that is exceedingly well positioned to get its ideas considered and circulated, and to have them have an impact in the larger system. So the Federalist Society is supported by an infrastructure that helps translate its ideas into law. So think about things like conservative think tanks and conservative media that really do a very good job of amplifying those ideas. You could also think very concretely about like the network of judicial clerkships that enables members of the Federalist Society to gain positions of influence where they have a tremendous impact on what ideas move forward. Imagine the kind of generative power that ordinary citizens could be exercising if they had kind of an infrastructure. So imagine if citizens from life in the US had the space and the time and the resource to generate political ideas together, and also the institutional support to circulate those ideas in ways that might really affect politics. I think when generative power is concentrated on we don't just get an unfair democracy, although we certainly do. We also get a less imaginative democracy. Get a democracy that can't even see some of the problems that ought to be solving, that can't conceive of some of the political possibilities that might address those problems. If we care about democracy, and I do very much, then I think we should care about it. I think we should recognize that democracy needs the insights that people can generate when they come together in these kinds of enclaves. I worry that we're losing it today. I worry that political ideas are being generated in enclaves that don't have the infrastructure they need to make those ideas impactful in our larger system. And I think some are being generated at all because citizens don't have the time and the space and the support to come together and deliberate. I think that leaves our democracy impoverished. I think it leaves it thinner than it needs to be. I think it leaves it less capable of imagining futures that aren't already decided array of options for the future.
Okay. Two questions and to the table discussion.
Hi, Clarissa. I'm apparently your neighbor, but we've never met. My name's and I do in funding what the lab calls radical imagination, which is essentially what you're talking about. To ask you, just ask you. To generate ideas is huge to me. And in our history, countries of those spaces. How do you move those spaces and who? I'm thinking, you know, like so.
Well, that's an important question, and it's a really huge one. And I don't think I have a really complete answer for you, but my initial thought is when I think of examples of when you sort of invited me to think about historical examples where we've had a really rich set of deliberative enclaves, I thought about things like the Black church in the middle of the century. I thought about things like the bookshops and consciousness raising groups that we think about when we think about second wave feminism. My thought is that those spaces created from below tend not to be spaces that are sort of given to citizens, as it were, from the power. So, you know, in general, I think when people want to exercise power, they have to take the power. And I think, as you were suggesting, you do community. Do that at grassroots level.